Welcome back. This is week 14, lecture 1. The what is it? The French Wars, Religion, and the Edict of Nantes. This lecture turns back to France to see how the Reformation impact we have talked about previously in France developed and came to a settlement, at least temporarily. We have been looking at, say, settlements in many ways. Within the empire, we talked about the developments from the Confession of Augsburg in 1530, the Schmalkaldic Wars, and then finally the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which have settled the matter, so to speak, even if not necessarily in a way that was um, all that acceptable to either side. And then in England, we talked about the Elizabethan Compromise, which is also known as the Elizabethan Settlement. And we've looked at the Catholic Reformation, Catholic/Counter-Reformation, and the so-called settlement with the Council of Trent, the establishment of the Jesuits, and let's say the insularization of Roman Catholicism within Europe, combined with the globalization of Roman Catholicism and the missionary activities. And now we look to France. And this is all, again, looking at, let's say, we could almost say the impact of Reformation movements in the various European countries. And this is getting near the end of the course because after this lecture, we have week 14, lecture 2, which deals with confessionalization, or what has been called the age of confessionalization. And in many ways, these settlements are all part of confessionalization, which I'll be talking about, obviously, in more detail and greater length next lecture. But it's looking at the outcomes and transformations of Europe as a result of Reformation movements. And with France, it also turned very bloody. Almost everywhere we look, except for the staunchly Catholic territories, it caused military conflict, or at least violent conflict, with Bloody Mary in England. They didn't have their civil war until the 17th century. But with the Empire, the Schmalkaldic War, and the tensions there, and then with France, we had what's been called the Wars of Religion. There was essentially civil war in France. How did that come about? What were the outcomes thereof? Will be what we're looking at today. Now, when we left France, more or less, if I can remember, talked about Calvin having fled Paris, being in Geneva, working to still always to convert France, to smuggle books in, to smuggle pastors in who would come to Geneva, be trained, and then be sent back into France. And that endeavor to Protestantize France was very successful in many ways. And we'll be getting into that shortly. And I think I already mentioned that the French Protestants, or Calvinists, were known as the Huguenots. And so we have these two factions in France, the royal faction, and then the increasingly expanding Huguenot faction. So that's really kind of this tense movement, especially after the affair of the placards, when Francis I switches his policy and really cracks down on heresy, trying to rid France of Protestantism or any Protestant taint. And we'll see what happens when we get there today. So, if that kind of sets the stage as we're rapidly coming to the end of this course, we can then look at what's going on here, which is an exciting time. It was a horrible time to live through. I think it's a fascinating period to look back on and to see, again, the relationship in some ways between religion and politics, because no one at this time on either side adopted the position really of this is purely political or this is purely theological, where we aren't willing to fight for it. religion and politics in terms of the state were one and the same thing, as they always had been. I think that's difficult for us to kind of grasp and to realize in our perspective, where they are in some ways completely separate. Even if we can talk about the political dimensions of religion, especially in this day and age, um, in our country anyway, it was a different relationship in the 16th century and always previously. This goes all the way back to Rome. The whole concept of Christendom as this Christian empire, and then the components thereof, and how do those relate to each other and to the whole. And obviously, I've been stressing during this 16th century, we find the crumbling of Christendom, or the breaking up of Christendom, the end of Christendom. I stated with the Peace of Augsburg, at least for the empire. And with France, it was really still in balance. What would happen and which way France would actually go, and how would they solve the conflicts? So that being said, we can start to where we more or less left off. And here we have the first slide, Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. And both of these figures are bigger than life in many ways. Now, the King of France, during most of the time that we've been discussing previous, was Francis I. I refer to him as the first early modern monarch, and Francis dies in 1547. If we look at the date, just think about it a bit. This age of confessionalization, as I'll be talking about it in the next lecture, really comes about as second generation. We've already talked about second generation reformers. It's referred to as Calvin as a second generation reformer. Maybe we should refer to third generation. But the leaders of the original movements are dying. Luther dies in 1546. Francis I dies in 1547. Henry VIII dies in 1548. What impact does that have from these great leaders, great monarchs, when their successors take over? And Francis dies. He was a Valois. He'd been fighting Charles V, as I said. And he dies in 1547, but he has certainly an heir, namely Henry II. And Henry II becomes king in 1547 after his father dies. He had married an Italian princess, Catherine de' Medici, in 1533. And the Medici were one of the most powerful and wealthiest families in Italy. They're the Medici Bank, going back to the 14th century when it first was emerging and gaining ascendancy and power. And in some ways, the Medici in Florence are almost synonymous with Renaissance Florence. So it was a major alliance that was being forged. Obviously, being Italian, Catherine comes from a staunchly Catholic family, loyal to Rome and the Pope. And Henry II continues his policies of Francis I as the most Christian king of France. There is a TV series or streaming series on Catherine that is not horrible, but it's not all historical by any means, but it points to some of the issues involved. And one of the things it points to is, even if not always historically accurately, is that she was an outstanding leader. But we'll get to that when we do. She's one of the great queens, let's say, or actually queen mothers, even though she found herself in a horrible position. That included having to put up with her husband, who was having a relationship on the side that was basically open. Everybody knew it, so there were tensions there. But Catherine was able to politically manage the marriage very, very well, and certainly Henry was not. How do I say this? Henry did his duty too, so to speak, because Catherine and Henry had 4 sons. It seemed that the Valois dynasty, the monarch being the Valois, was very secure, because Henry is still relatively a young man. I forget exactly when he was born. He's certainly not ancient. He's in the vigor of his maturity. Um, and within 4 sons, it seems that the Valois was pretty well set. Now, the problem is, actually, they had 5 sons because they're having on the slide, just as a note too, Henry becomes heir to the throne upon the death of his brother Francis in 1536. Their first child, Francis, um, died prematurely, so he's not even seen as heir to the throne or in the line because he uh, never acceded to the throne. They also had a couple of daughters as well. I forget how many in total. I think they had. I think Catherine ended up having like 8 or 9 or 10 children. Um, and so, in that sense, the dynasty, the family, seemed to be in very good shape. But the accidents of life, so to speak, um, undermined all of that. And the first problem was then with when Henry died prematurely in 1560. This then moves us to the second slide with the Colloquy of Poissy in 1561. Because when Henry dies in 1560, Francis II, Louis, then ended up dying. So his first 2 sons died before ascending to the throne. Francis then assumes the throne in 1560. He's still young. He's about 14, I think it was, or so when he became king. And Catherine then assumes a much greater role in the policy of France and the governing of France, and tries to deal with the problems of the Huguenots within France and how do we settle all these things. Now, when we look at Henry II, he was very much, how do we say this? He would have made his father proud. He was a warrior. He was very manly, so to speak. And of course, he was very prolific. And he had his mistress on the side, who was also a lady of court, and everyone knew she was. She was an older woman. And so he was in some ways your Frenchman's Frenchman. And we'll see that coming back in some ways with Henry IV when we get there. But the way he died was premature and was very much an accident. He was participating in a jousting tournament. Now, I have that up there, not the jousting tournament, but before he dies, the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 kind of put an end to the Valois-Habsburg Wars. And talked a lot in the past about the issues there, the wars between Charles V and Francis I. Those kind of continued, and then when Charles abdicates in 1555, it continued with Emperor Ferdinand, Charles's brother. But in 1559, that was all kind of settled and came to a resolution. And so Henry had the opportunity then to really kind of focus on France and deal with the problem of heresy within France. And Henry continued the policy of his father, Francis I, of really trying to exterminate and rid France of heresy, Protestantism. That's the basic stance that Henry was taking. This is a Catholic country. We have a certain amount of independence from the Pope as such, which goes back to at least the mid-15th century, and then also renewed in the early 16th century. The Pope had granted the French Church, the Gallican Church, a number of privileges in terms of independence and being able to run their own affairs. And Henry, as king, was going to make sure that his house was in order, so to speak. But then he dies. And he died in a jousting tournament. This is after the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. And a jousting tournament is ceremonial, of course. So no one is trying to kill their opponent, at least by intent. And Henry certainly is the king, so he has a special status, so to speak, and no one's going to try to kill the king. But you also don't want to be too wimpy, so to speak. I mean, you want to let the king show his studliness, and you can do that by being studly yourself. And the king, of course, was in full armor, not a problem on a war horse. And people are watching, of course. I mean, Catherine is there, and his mistress is there, and another poor slap to the face of poor Catherine. Henry was wearing the sign or the handkerchief or whatever it would be of his mistress, not of Catherine, um, which was an irritation. But in this joust, and they're jousting along, and they clash. Being in full armor, he's completely protected, with one exception: his eyes. A splinter splintered off from his opponent's javelin and penetrated right through his helmet, right through his eye, and through his brain. Again, it was one of those weird accidents that happened to Henry. So, in the prime of his vigor, he is now dead, and his third surviving son, Francis II, assumes the throne in 1560, which is when the joust was taking place in 1560. But he was a weakling of sorts. We're not really sure, or if it is securely known. I don't remember exactly why he died. But he dies shortly after he assumes the throne in 1560. And so the third surviving son assumes the throne, Charles IX, but he's much younger. He is age 10. And so Catherine all of a sudden assumes the position of Queen Mother and the regency. So she actually is the leader of France until Charles can assume his majority to lead for himself. Now, I already mentioned that Francis was about 14 or 15. Catherine was not the regent with Francis, and so the majority of a monarch at this time could be in the mid-teens anyway. It was when the nobles deemed him sufficient to be able to rule on his own. But before that age, certainly age 10, he becomes king, but it's realized that he needs oversight and help. And so his mother is there, but so are the other nobles who are trying to influence him. And Catherine has to balance ruling France, dealing with Charles's monarchy, because he again has to issue the proclamations. So if she thinks that X should be done, she has to make sure that Charles will actually proclaim that X needs to be done. Whereas the nobles are of various factions, are also trying to gain Charles's ear and persuade Charles what he should do. So it can be a real mess, and Catherine is really struggling, but she's trying, and she was in an impossible situation in some ways, as we'll see. But in many ways, I mean, she's considered to be one of the great leaders, the great monarchs, even though she technically wasn't queen like Elizabeth was, of the 16th century. Now, the religious problem certainly had remained because neither Francis I nor Henry II could rid France of the Protestants, of the Huguenots. And Catherine thought, we need to figure out a way to deal with this. We've seen what happened in the empire. We don't want that happening here. Can we come to some sort of a compromise, a way to, let's say, live together without it really being an acknowledgement of two different confessions within France, because we can't have that, obviously. But some way that we can avoid bloodshed and allow a rapprochement, so to speak, between the two sides. Well, what we need to do in order to do that is to talk about it. So we need to have a colloquy, which is what the term colloquy means, between Catholics and then the Huguenots, And even Calvin doesn't die until 1564, but his successor and right-hand man at the time was Theodore Beza. Beza went to the Colloquy of Poissy to speak for Calvin, say, okay, how can we work together? Now, 1559 was also the year of the final edition of Calvin's Institutes. I think there was a French translation, I think came out in 1560. So this is the culmination of Calvin's position. And Beza, who was also at the Academy and very much working very closely with Calvin, would certainly speak for Calvin at Poissy. So that was a positive in that sense, that Catherine wants to have a dialogue. So, okay, how can we work this out? Some of the nobles, though, already mentioned, I think, that some of the nobles, even princes of the blood, had become Protestant, had become Huguenots. But others certainly were not, were staunch hardline Catholics. And the leader of that faction was the Duke of Guise, who was vehemently against any concession to the Protestants. So it is a real diplomatic effort that Catherine is kind of trying to bring about. And what came out of the Colloquy of Poissy was not a solution, but I say a compromise solution, at least for the time being. And that was to say, okay, we will not continue active persecution of Protestants. We will not actively seek them out and try to rid France of Protestants. Henry, Duke of Guise, pay attention. The Guise were the villains, so to speak, in all of this. But yet, the Huguenots really can't be seen. In some ways, this was don't ask, don't tell kind of a solution. As long as we don't see Protestants, as long as we don't have to deal with the Protestants, we're not going to actively go after them so they can worship. They can congregate, as long as it's not in Paris, within like a 10-mile radius of Paris. And as long as they're not really basically seen in many ways. So that was not really satisfactory to either side, but it was an attempt to say, okay, how can we maintain peace and have stability within the kingdom? Right? Well, that didn't last very long. Because March 1st, 1562, we have the Duke of Guise who'd gone out hunting. This is I haven't heard the massacre of Vassy before. Vassy is to the east and a little bit south of Paris. I'm not sure how many miles. It's not just on the outskirts. But the Duke of Guise was returning from a hunting party with a friend. And Vassy was a rather small village. And outside of the village, in a barn, there were a group of Huguenots worshiping and singing psalms and having their worship service. And along comes the Duke of Guise's hunting party. They heard them singing psalms, and the Huguenots at Vassy were not trying to flaunt what they were doing. They were not trying to say, we want to do this out in the open. They're in a barn in the countryside. But the Duke just happens to hear them. And says, aha, this is an opportunity. We're not supposed to hear Protestants singing psalms. The Huguenots inside the barn are like, uh-oh, the Duke of Guise is outside. Well, they invited him to come in, at least to observe what was going on, maybe even join them. And in some ways, joined them he did, because the Duke of Guise and his men went into the barn and slaughtered all the Huguenots who were there. It's called the Massacre of Vassy. and it sent outrage throughout the realm, certainly among the Protestants, who then started to mobilize and said, we have to respond to this. This is an outrage. This is breaking the Colloquy of Poissy agreement. The Catholics were somewhat embarrassed, but to the Catholic Party, the hardline Catholic Party was somewhat embarrassed a little bit, but was, felt that they were completely in their right to do so. And Catherine has to figure out how to deal with this. But because of this massacre at Vassy and the inability to really um, effectively deal with the problem, the issue, we have the mobilization of the Huguenots, and we have the outbreak of the First War of Religion, so the Civil War of 1562 and 1563. Now, here, this is just a historiographical tradition. The armed conflict, the military conflict in France has been called for quite a long time the religious wars in France. Was it over religion? Yes. But so were the Schmalkaldic Wars. So were some of the policies of Mary Tudor when she assumed the throne in England. So it's the same kind of phenomenon of armed military conflict, basically civil war, and that has somehow more depth to it than wars of religion. Seems to almost say not that big of a deal, but it was a horrible deal and a big deal indeed, and it split France in entrenched positions. There was a series of, depending on how we counted, like 8 civil wars. Obviously, these are more like extended battles. First Civil War, 62 63. And obviously, since there's a string of 8 of them, they're never really settled. And they're never settled until we get to the end of this lecture. Because no side had achieved a sufficient victory to, let's say, render the other side impotent. That's the ongoing. So there's ongoing conflict. Now, so then what happens? The Guise and Charles and Francis II, or Charles the Ninth, actually, with Catherine as regent, are trying to figure out what to do about all of this. Second war breaks out, 67 to 68, and the third, 68 to 70. And they feel they need to really find a solution. Now, Catherine had an idea. She said, if we can ally with the Huguenot, or at least eventually, maybe that could be a way forward. And a Huguenot Prince of the Blood, Henry of Navarre, Prince of Navarre, was not the leader of the Huguenot, but he was second or third in line to lead the Huguenot faction. Admiral Coligny was the first in line. And Catherine said, if we can, let's say, try to arrange a marriage between Henry of Navarre and Marguerite, we have one of the leaders of the Huguenots who will be married to my daughter. That can help. So we'll try to arrange for a royal wedding between Marguerite and Henry. The only problem is Henry of Navarre is a Protestant. He's a Huguenot. But we can deal with that. So the arrangement was made. And he's like, okay, that'd be a good idea. Maybe I can persuade the other side with this marriage alliance. And so the wedding was all set to take place in Paris on August 24th. The problem was when Henry came to Paris for the wedding, he was captured and forced to convert. Okay, you have to convert to Catholicism. You're going to marry our daughter. Marry my daughter. So he begrudgingly agreed to convert to Catholicism. I mean, he was forced to. It was a forced conversion. But when he accepted, he was already there. He didn't have much choice. But then the Guise are, more than just whispering in Charles IX's ear. They're saying we have this opportunity with this royal wedding because all the Huguenot leaders will be here. If we have some targeted assassinations, we can decapitate the entire movement. Catherine, at first, when she heard of this, was like, no, 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 no. Charles isn't really sure. I mean, he's still not very old. He had been in his majority by now, but Catherine was still a very powerful figure. And what do we do? Catherine, again, reluctantly agreed to the targeted assassinations. Charles was more leaning towards the Guise. And Catherine was kind of flustered, didn't know how to politically prevent this anyway. And again, she's no longer the one primarily in charge. So that was the plan. Have the wedding. We're forcing Henry of Navarre to convert. We'll have the wedding, join the two houses. And that will help towards ending the conflict, at least down the road. Now, if we can get rid of the leaders again of the Huguenots, once again, it will fall apart. That has been a strategy that has never really succeeded, even though it's one that is repeated again and again. Trying to get rid of the movement, going back to the persecutions of Christianity, the great persecution of Diocletian. Get rid of the leaders, the bishops, movement will dissipate. Didn't happen. So in France, the same issue is there. Problem was, they are there for the wedding. They have the targeted assassinations. But all hell breaks loose. Starts with Admiral de Coligny. Let's get rid of Admiral de Coligny, the leader, and some others are being killed too. And just massacres start happening, not only in Paris, but all across France. It's known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre because August 24th is St. Bartholomew's Day. It was just a free all of killing Huguenots. And there, all hell breaks loose, and it does. This was far beyond Catherine's approval. The Guise probably were celebrating it and rejoicing in it, and actually they may have been planning it all along, unbeknownst to Catherine. That certainly has been speculated, and seems to be because it was a pretty massive affair. Of course, they didn't assassinate Henry of Navarre. He married Marguerite. So what do we do? The reaction to the Massacre of St. Bartholomew on the parts of the Huguenots was fierce. So you can't trust them. I mean, first of all, we have the massacre at Vassy, the Duke of Guise, same kind of thing. We can't trust them. We can't trust the Catholics. And look what they have done. And this lasted for generations in France. So what is Henry going to do as a resort? He finally escapes court, where he was basically a prisoner, a house prisoner. Returns to his territories with Navarre, which is kind of on the French-Spanish border, and proclaims that he's converting back to Protestantism. Now, with the assassinations and the massacre, Henry now is leader of the Huguenot faction. He is the only one left to be the titular head of the Huguenots. And I can't exactly explain how he fits into the royal line, but he's also potentially an heir to the throne of France. Not as a Valois, but as an adjacent branch of the, actually, it all comes from the Capetians, known as the Bourbons. So he is Henry Bourbon of Navarre. And he actually was going to be next in line after Henry III. So the fact that we have a prince of the blood as the leader of the opposition party, if you're on the Catholic side of things, is scary. How do we handle this? And this event, this St. Bartholomew's Day's massacre, entered, let's say, the national consciousness. I mean, it's hard to talk about a national anything at this time, but it really was a lasting impact on from throughout all classes of society, because it was bloody. And there are stories of one of the a later Huguenot leader whose father was murdered, brothers were murdered. He survived the massacre because he was a boy of about 12. No, that's not why he survived. He survived because he played dead, kind of hiding underneath the bodies of his father and brothers. He stuttered thereafter. He was extremely effective. That's the level of the animosity that is involved. The impact that something like this had. So this is, you can say, is this simply a religious, theological conflict opposition? Is it simply a political opposition? It's one and the same, and the depth of the feeling and the impact can only be seen if it is this complete whole and not divided into, oh, that's one part and this is one part. And the long-lasting impact on the personal level was huge. Don't forget, that was one of the slogans that came out. Don't forget what they did. They can't be trusted. They slaughtered and murdered us. Don't forget. Now, when we look then at some of the outcomes here, we find that, again, the fate of history, so to speak, is very fickle, and once you think everything is set and secure, it proves otherwise. Because Charles IX, too, was a rather sickly person, and he dies in 1574. So all of a sudden, Henry III assumes the throne. And Henry III was the last son of, oh my gosh, I don't believe I have it there. I have the last of Francis I and Catherine's sons on the PowerPoint slide. Please know that is not correct. It is the last of Henry II and Catherine's sons. I don't know why I had to catch that previously, and I'm sorry. But can at least in your mind cross out there Francis I and Catherine's sons and have Henry II and Catherine's sons there. He is the last in the line of the Valois. So all of a sudden, Henry becomes hugely important. No one thought he was going to, become king. He had, three brothers, actually four brothers early on, ahead of him, but at one time, three brothers anyway, or two brothers, surviving brothers ahead of him. No one thought it was going to be a problem. It'd almost be like if Harry and Meghan becomes King of England, because with William and then their boys being first in line, all of a sudden Harry would be like, "What? I'm king? Oh my God, what do I do?" Don't take that analogy too far. Certainly, one difference between Harry and today in England and Henry III was that Henry III was not married. It was also a worry because it was kind of somewhat clear that he probably wouldn't be married. Basically, he was seen as being gay, and that he liked poodles more than he did women. He too, though, was young, but he didn't have to have a regent for anything. And he is in a horrible situation, as you can imagine. And I'm not talking here about the issue of producing an heir, even though that too was a major problem and issue. He's caught um, in this horrible political, theological, religious context. He's the cousin of Henry of Navarre, who now is the leader of the Huguenots. And the Duke of Guise is also named Henry, um, and he is still a hardline Catholic faction. And Henry III, in some ways, was more like his mother. He's trying to figure out a way to negotiate between the two extremes, and he wasn't all that successful. But this was a problem in France, because the next in line for the throne after Henry was Henry III was Henry of Navarre, who was a Protestant, who was a Huguenot. Could there be a Protestant king of France? Now, if Henry III had simply, gotten married, whether he wanted to or not, and somehow produced an heir, it wouldn't have been an issue. But he didn't, and the recognition that there was no successor, direct successor for Henry III, that direct offspring, in terms of blood, a heretic was going to be king, the Catholic position. Now, for the Protestant position, it was like, this is potentially very good. We have an opportunity. Political theory was reached a high point here in terms of books and pamphlets being written and issued arguing for one or the other side. The Protestant side was very much so, Henry III is a tyrant because he's continuing the Catholic policies of the Duke of Guise that had led to the massacre of Vassy and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. We're still at war with the Catholics, and what we need to do is rid France of this tyrant who is killing us and massacring us. So the idea on the Protestant side was that the princes of the blood within the royal line, directly or not, could rid themselves of a tyrant. What do you do if the king is horrible? If you have a crazy king or a bad king, it's not right to rebel. It's, Paul says, the powers that be are ordained of God. A lot of the political theory previously had been that even if you have, well, Augustinus of Ancona even argued, even if you have a bad pope, you can't get rid of the pope. You still have to follow a bad pope. You just don't follow an heretical pope. So in some ways, it's like you still have to follow a bad king, but when does the king become a tyrant? And what constitutes becoming a tyrant? The question had been discussed in the Middle Ages, going back to the 12th century. John of Salisbury, I think I may have mentioned, is it legitimate to overthrow a tyrant? Can we kill a tyrant? That was essentially the Protestant side, that Henry III is a tyrant. We should get rid of Henry and proclaim Henry of Navarre as King of France. The Catholics, on the other hand, were arguing, no, it's simply about blood. The succession is one of blood. Now, this was going back and forth, arguing by scholars, the university, publishing books, trying to, again, bolster the position of the respective parties. Henry the third was kind of caught within all of this, not really sure what to do. He didn't like the Guise. He was not, let's say, a hardline Catholic. He actually was somewhat friendly with his cousin Henry of Navarre, and even at one point, which basically named Henry his successor. We have up there, I said, the War of the Three Henrys. This this is I think like the seventh war of religion, again on how one counts. Um, the Duke of Guise was fighting Henry III, and Henry of Navarre was fighting both of them as well, and they both were fighting Henry, even though it was Henry III and Henry of Navarre were somewhat allied against the Henry Duke of Guise, but it was a mess because Henry the Duke of Guise is pushing for this more hardline position, still of let's rid France of the heretics. So it's known as the War of the Three Henrys. In 1589, it's not known who did this, but it's basically pretty sure that it was someone within the faction of the Duke of Guise, of the Guise family, maybe even been a priest, that's been suggested, assassinated Henry III. That was a big deal, to assassinate the king. Interestingly, it was not a Protestant who did it. It was a Catholic who did it, who was on the hardcore faction. They thought, Henry III, we have to get rid of. Um, we'll proclaim Henry, Duke of Guise, as king because we can't have a heretic as king of France. It's just not acceptable, not possible. Could be. But that put the entire country into a problem. I have here the last, well, not the last slide, but Henry IV and the final solution with quotations around final. That was the question. Could there be a Protestant French king with the assassination of Henry III? Based on blood, Henry IV, or Henry of Navarre, was heir to the throne. This is what's become so fascinating to me, is that with this situation, the political theory switched sides. The political theory visited switching positions. All of a sudden, the Protestant theorists started arguing for blood, that you cannot get rid of a tyrant, that the blood trumps your dislike for the monarch. And the Catholics switched to saying you can get rid of a tyrant, and a Protestant would be a tyrant. And so it's like, okay, what's the basis or purpose of political theory? And that would be a fun topic to discuss, especially in a philosophy or political philosophy class. But I just wanted to mention it here in terms of the issues and the tensions involved with the death of Henry III and the assumed ascension of Henry IV. It was not going to be easy. And if Henry IV was to become king, Henry of Navarre, so I shouldn't refer to him as Henry IV until he actually becomes king, he was going to have to fight for it. And he did. And Henry IV was one of the heroes in French history. I said he kind of was I won't say the reincarnation of Henry II because he was even better than that. In many ways, and especially after Henry III, whom no one really liked. He was seen as a weak and an effeminate king. Henry IV was a man's man, so to speak, and this is before the time of gender equality and things. But also it's an issue of being a warrior. I'm not going to go into the issue of, can you have a great warrior? Can a great warrior also be gay? That's, I don't have any problem saying that whatsoever. But at the time, that's just how it's seen in terms of the gender roles. Women can be very forceful queens, but if that makes any sense. Henry was a French. Henry IV became a French legend, but he had to fight his way for it. He was a brilliant general. And it was a very difficult situation he faced. And the country was split. And I have up here a map that shows the religious divisions within France. The date up there is 1585 to 1598, with the slashed lines being places where Huguenot rule, or Huguenot were ascendancy. The red being where the Guise control the Catholic League. They formed a league of let's say the hardcore Catholic princes. uh, against the Huguenots and trying to persuade the crown, whoever that was, to follow along. And then we have the yellow possession, which were in Henry Henry of Navarre's territories in the family of the Bourbon. And so there are pockets, as you can see, of Bourbon territory that were not as such controlled by the Huguenots, even though Henry Bourbon, Henry of Navarre, was the leader of the Huguenots. But you can just look at that just in terms of territory. It's pretty, almost fairly evenly divided. And so it is really already a split country on that level. Now, what to do all about it? How does Henry establish himself? He fights against the Catholic League to establish his own right to the throne. So in 4 years' time, he defeats the Catholic League. He was seen as a brilliant general. Then after he achieves victory in 1593, so he's in ascendancy, then he claims, I will convert. We have the phrase up there, Paris is worth a mass. It's not certain whether Henry actually said that. The idea was Paris, of course, is the capital, and it has been interpreted as saying that Henry converted to become king and didn't really care about the religion. Of course, he'd already converted first to from Protestantism or Calvinism to Catholicism in terms of the marriage to Marguerite, and then back to Protestantism after he escaped court after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And so it's like he can just change sides without worrying about it. Other scholars have argued no, this was a serious issue for him, and he was not going to convert. A lot of people said, it was telling him just convert back to Catholicism and we'll accept you as king. He's like, no, I'm going to assert my right, my blood right to be king. And he fought for it, and he defeated the Catholics. And then he said, as a gift to the country, I will convert. And again, one of my undergraduate TAs, who I got to be fairly close with and in touch with, wrote an important book on Henry IV, Ron Love, and his conversion. And argued that for Henry, he underwent back instruction, and we have letters from Henry saying there is something to this religion. So whether he was sincere, whether he was simply out for his own benefits, and it was simply a political move, there's no definitive answer there. But what we can say is that Henry did not convert until after he had won militarily. He converts in 1594, enters Paris, is crowned king, in the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty. Also seen as, in some ways, the establishment, in those can point to earlier developments, of what became known as the politiques. It's a French term there, the politiques. This was, going back to the political theory, position of what matters most is the state. It's not religion, it's the state. The politique faction is like, who cares what the religion is? The state is more important. And this is not, I'm not going to say it's not a modern position, but it was a position that emerged as a result of all the conflict and wars. Not only in France, but you would point to politique theorists, other places too, but certainly in a minority position. And even the politiques were not atheists. There were no atheists at this time. It was not that they were not believers or didn't think Christianity was serious, He just pointed out that we're never really going to come to a solution, and we can't allow theology and religion to cripple and destroy our country, our state. In some ways, we can see Henry Navarre taking that position. In terms of, is Paris worth a mass? Is France worth a mass? Because that's what Paris meant. I mean, France. Is the good of the country worth changing my religious adherence? Now again, what Henry IV really believed, what any of the individuals in the 16th century really believed, it's difficult to say. You know their actions. You know what they did, the arguments for what they did and why they did it. We can't know. Did Francis I, was he a zealot for Catholicism? Or was he simply looking out for France, and therefore was willing to make his alignment with Suleiman the Magnificent against Charles? Or was he a politique? I mean, in terms of sincerity on this level, it's very difficult to say. Almost impossible to really determine. We're talking about the hearts and minds of people who have been dead for centuries. How do we get back at that? And none of these figures left a personal diary with their, innermost thoughts and feelings, which too would be suspect, but anyway. But as a policy, as a development, as an outcome of some of these issues, in some ways, the politique position is not all that dissimilar from Sebastian Castellio's to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, it's simply to kill a man. The realization that there was something more important than asserting the absolute truth of a given religious confession, because that was proving very difficult to do. And meanwhile, Europe was falling apart with religious division, civil war. What do we do? Yeah. Henry IV, securing his reign, came up with a solution for France, and in 1598 issued the Edict of Nantes, in which he granted rights and privileges to the Huguenots. In some ways, it almost goes one step beyond the arrangement at the Colloquy at Poissy, because what Henry said is, okay, in particular territories, Huguenots have the right to openly worship, to openly practice. They can proselytize, meaning they can try to convert people. They can practice their faith, their beliefs, their religion, but not near Paris. They can't be anywhere within 10 miles of Paris. And if we look back at that map that I had up there, that was some pretty extensive territory. So in effect, this is not that dissimilar from the Peace of Augsburg. It said, he who rules who's the rule his religion, or whose reign his religion, or every territory should have one prince and should have one religion. In some ways, that's what we find with the Edict of Nantes, that in those areas that the Huguenots were strongholds, they could practice their religion. Now, it doesn't go so far as the Peace of Augsburg to say that if you live there and are Catholic, you can't be Catholics. There can be Catholics there. There can be Huguenots in primarily Catholic areas, so it's not an exclusive issue. It is a compromise. It is recognizing the legitimacy of another religious confession. That was seen to solve the problem. I didn't put the word final in quotation marks for no reason. It wasn't the final solution, and problems are already looming even with the Edict of Nantes. What are some of those problems that would become major issues as we move on into the 17th century, which are beyond the boundaries of this course as such? Well, number one is the continued conviction of theological religious truths and willing to take political action to support, defend, and implement those truths on both sides. Henry IV himself was assassinated in 1610. His son, a few sons, but his oldest son, the heir to the throne, came to the throne. His name was Louis. He was 13th Louis, who had been king of France, so he was Louis the 13th. Of course, his son, Louis the 14th, is the Sun King, and eventually Louis the 14th revokes the Edict of Nantes. It's like 1689 or something like that. Look up the precise date. He revokes the Edict of Nantes. He proclaims, not only I am the state, he's the French absolutism, divine right of kings, but also, has the phrase "one law, one king, one faith," or one king, one faith, one law, which in some ways had been the principle all along, but he is asserted. He also had to deal with, as did Louis the 13th, or Louis the 13th had to deal with what became known as the 30 Years' War from 18 to 48. Europe broke out in war all over again. The English Civil War. And the 30 Years' War has been said to say it started as yet another religious war and ended as strictly political fighting, ended in the Peace of Westphalia in 1640. It's also been called the first true world war, at least with respect to Europe, because here the fighting was not simply within England or within France or within the empire. It was European-wide, essentially. Sweden became very much a part of it, and it did begin over, in some ways, the exclusion of the Calvinists from the Peace of Augsburg. And it led to a new, in some ways not new at all, but a new peace to accept various religious confessions. Even as Louis XIV then reasserts Catholic France and as a Catholic king, Christian king, with the period of absolutism. In England, the Civil War ends up with called the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, a Protestant, a Puritan, which then led to the Restoration. And so there's problems still remain throughout Europe. And the divisions and the infighting and the alliances as we move further into the developments into the 17th, 18th, and even into the 19th century of Europe, and as we get towards modern Europe, these old alliances and divisions and conflicts cannot be understood without looking at the developments of the 16th century and the impact of the Reformation. Now, that wraps up the France aspect in terms of this course, and obviously the end, as T.S. Eliot says, my end is my beginning. And with history, beginning points and ending points are all artificial, because the processes, the developments, the evolution, whatever you want to call it, historical change, just continues. We will look on the next lecture about the age of professionalization and look at some of the developments within the state structure in Europe and how this transformation from medieval Christendom to the early modern state came about and how the religious theological issues were central thereto, and replacing what I'd call the myth of Christendom with the myth of the nation state of early modern into modern Europe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.